"Fighter pilot, anyone?" The captain's voice, usually a smooth drawl, cracked like ice. 30 years in the sky, and now this. Alarms blared. Outside, a storm brewed, but inside it was worse. No one moved, until a girl, couldn't have been more than 14, stood up. "I can help," she said, quiet but firm. Folks scoffed, muttered about kids today. They didn't know about her mother, the colonel, about the years of training in simulators that would make seasoned pilots weep. Here's the thing they didn't know. Ella wasn't just offering help. She was offering Dorothy's promise etched in her heart. Her grandma was dying, but kindness could yet save her plane. They had no idea how her quiet kindness would change everything. His 25 years of flying experience couldn't have prepared him for this moment. The cockpit is flashing with warning lights, alarms are screaming, and his co-pilot, Jennifer Walsh, is staring at instrument panels she's never seen fail simultaneously. 220 passengers are about to face their worst nightmare at 37,000 FTST. Listen to the chaos erupting in the cabin. Passengers are whipping their heads around, searching desperately for anyone who might save their lives. Business travelers are gripping their armrests. Mothers are clutching their children, and the elderly man in seat 12C is quietly praying. Flight attendants are rushing down the aisles, their professional masks slipping as panic sets in. Everyone is looking for a hero, for someone with the skills to bring this massive aircraft safely to the ground. But here's what nobody on Flight 892 could have imagined. The two people who could save every single life on that plane were fast asleep in economy seats, 23A and 23B. Two 14-year-old black twin girls who had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated from the moment they stepped onto this aircraft. Ella and Stella Williams looked like typical teenagers, but they possessed skills that would make seasoned pilots jealous. Welcome back to Black and Bruised Stories. If you're new here, you've just joined a community dedicated to truth, justice, and survival. Show some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Ella Williams shifts slightly in her sleep, her curly hair falling across her face as turbulence rocks the aircraft. In her lap rests a worn copy of Advanced Aircraft Systems, reading material that would challenge most engineering students. Her sister Stella sleeps peacefully beside her, dreaming of spacecraft and distant planets, completely unaware that her thousands of hours on flight simulators are about to become the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. Nobody on that plane could have imagined that these two dismissed teenagers would become their only hope for survival. But by the time Flight 892 touched the ground, these young girls would rewrite everything people thought they knew about heroes, expertise, and never judging a book by its cover. Let me tell you exactly how we got to this terrifying moment. 3 hours earlier, Ella and Stella Williams were standing in Denver International Airport, facing the same prejudice and assumptions they'd dealt with their entire lives. These weren't ordinary 14-year-olds. They were the daughters of Colonel Patricia Williams, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the United States Air Force, currently deployed overseas defending our freedom. Ella is the analytical twin, quiet, methodical, with a mind that processes technical information like a supercompute. She reads aviation manuals the way other kids read comic books, memorizing specifications, emergency procedures, and aircraft systems with photographic precision. She can tell you the exact fuel capacity, maximum altitude, and emergency protocols for virtually every commercial and military aircraft in service today. When other kids her age are worried about social media, Ella is studying the physics of flight and dreaming of becoming an aerospace engineer. Stella is Ella's opposite, but equal outgoing, confident, with an infectious enthusiasm for everything related to flight and space exploration. She wants to be an astronaut, to pilot spacecraft to Mars and beyond. While her classmates play video games, Stella spends countless hours on advanced flight simulators, mastering emergency scenarios that would challenge experienced pilots. She's the twin who asks a million questions, who wants to understand not just how things work, but why they work that way. Here's what makes their story absolutely extraordinary. These girls have been raised on military bases around the world: Germany, Japan, South Korea, and multiple bases across the United States. They've been surrounded by fighter jets, cargo planes, and some of the most skilled pilots on Earth since they could walk. Their mother and her fellow pilots recognized something special in these girls and began training them during off-duty hours when they were just 10 years old. We're talking about thousands of hours on military flight simulators. We're talking about training that covers everything from basic aircraft operation to complex emergency scenarios. These girls can identify any aircraft just by the sound of its engines. They know the difference between a Pratt and Whitney and a Rolls-Royce Turboan from 3M away. They've studied every major commercial aircraft model, memorized emergency checklists, and practice scenarios that most licensed pilots never encounter in their entire careers. Ella and Stella currently attend the Morrison Academy, a specialized STEM school designed specifically for military children. They're not just good students, they're exceptional. Advanced calculus, physics, aerospace engineering, meteorology, subjects that challenge college students, are routine coursework for these remarkable twins. Their teachers describe them as prodigies, but more importantly, they describe them as dedicated, hard-working young women who never let success go to their heads. But here's the heartbreaking reality these brilliant girls face every single day. The moment people see two young black teenagers, assumptions take over. Intelligence is questioned, capabilities are dismissed, experience is ignored. And on this flight, those prejudices almost cost everyone their lives. From the moment they entered Denver International Airport, Ella and Stella were treated like problems to be managed rather than passengers to be served. The gate agent, a woman named Carol Henderson, took one look at their unaccompanied minor status and assumed they needed constant supervision. She originally tried to separate their seats, claiming it was for safety reasons and that kids traveling alone should be distributed throughout the aircraft so flight attendants could monitor them more easily. The twins had their boarding passes, their identification, and all the proper documentation. They traveled alone dozens of times, moving between their mother's duty stations and their grandmother's home. But Carol saw two black teenagers and immediately assumed incompetence. She spoke to them slowly, using simple words, asking multiple times if they understood basic instructions about finding their gate and boarding procedures. Flight attendant Sandra Martinez had been flying for 15 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. The moment Ella and Stella boarded Flight 892, Sandra categorized them in her mind nervous first-time flyers who would need constant reassurance and hand-holding throughout the journey. Sandra prided herself on being able to read passengers, and everything about these girls screamed high maintenance to her experienced eye. Sandra immediately began her routine for anxious young flyers. She explained how seatbelts worked, pointed out the location of bathrooms, and assured them that flying was perfectly safe and they had nothing to worry about. She spoke in the patronizing tone that adults often use with children, never imagining that these children knew more about aircraft safety than she'd learned in her entire career. The worst treatment came from Mr. Peterson, a 52-year-old businessman who had upgraded to first class and believed that gave him the right to judge everyone in economy. The moment he saw Ella and Stella settling into their seats, he started complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. "Kids traveling alone make me nervous," he announced to his seatmate. "Airlines shouldn't allow it. They're probably going to be crying and carrying on the entire flight." Mr. Peterson actually approached Sandra during boarding and demanded that the girls be moved away from his section of the aircraft. "I paid good money for a peaceful flight," he said, gesturing dismissively toward the twins. "Those two look like trouble. Can't you put them in the back somewhere?" The irony would hit him like a freight train when those same troublesome kids would later save his life. But Ella and Stella had learned to handle this treatment with grace and dignity that would make their mother proud. Growing up in military families teaches you resilience, moving from base to base, country to country, dealing with new schools and new communities every few years. It builds character. These girls had faced prejudice before, and they'd learned that the best response was to prove people wrong through actions, not arguments. They settled into seats 23A and 23B, quietly pulling out their carefully packed carry-on bags. Ella had brought her aviation technical manuals and a notebook filled with hand-drawn aircraft diagrams. Stella had her tablet loaded with flight simulator programs and space exploration documentaries. They were carrying something else precious, too. Handmade model airplanes they'd crafted themselves, planning to show them to the woman who first inspired their love of flight. Their grandmother, Dorothy Williams, was dying. 78 years old, a veteran of the civil rights movement and a pioneer in aviation, Dorothy had been battling cancer for 3 years. 2 weeks ago, she called the girls with news that changed everything. The cancer had spread to her lungs and liver. Doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. This flight to Atlanta might be their last chance to see the woman who taught them that barriers exist to be broken, not accepted. Dorothy Williams was a mechanic for the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. While the pilots got the glory, Dorothy kept those aircraft flying with skill, dedication, and expertise that saved countless lives. She faced discrimination that makes today's challenges seem insignificant. She was told she wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy enough to work on the most advanced aircraft of her time. But Dorothy proved them all wrong, and she became one of the most respected mechanics in the entire program. Dorothy used to tell her granddaughters, "Baby girls, when people tell you that you can't do something because of how you look or how old you are, you show them what you can do with these hands and this mind. The sky isn't your limit. It's just your starting point." Those words echoed in Ella and Stella's minds as they settled in for what they hoped would be a quiet flight to see their hero one more time. Flight 892 was scheduled for a routine 2.5-hour journey from Denver to Atlanta. The Boeing 737-800 was a reliable workhorse, the kind of aircraft that flies thousands of safe flights every year. Captain Rodriguez had been flying this route for 8 years, and he could practically navigate it with his eyes closed. Co-pilot Walsh was newer to the airline, but she was competent and eager to learn. Weather reports showed clear skies with only minor turbulence expected. 220 passengers settled in for what should have been an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon flight. Business travelers opened their laptops, families distributed snacks and entertainment, and elderly passengers prepared for naps. Ella and Stella just wanted to sleep through most of the flight, so they could arrive rested for what might be their final visit with their grandmother. But as Flight 892 reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 ft, Ella's trained eye caught something that made her blood run cold. Through the reflection on Sandra's tablet screen, she could see portions of the cockpit instrument panel. What she saw there were warning indicators that would terrify any experienced pilot. Hydraulic pressure readings showing concerning patterns, engine temperature fluctuations that indicated developing problems, and electrical system warnings that suggested cascading failures were beginning. Ella had studied these exact scenarios in advanced simulators. She knew that what appeared to be minor issues could rapidly escalate into catastrophic emergencies if not addressed immediately. Her thousands of hours of training kicked in, and she tried to politely alert the crew to what she was observing. "Excuse me," Ella said quietly to Sandra during a routine cabin check. "I noticed some unusual engine vibration patterns during takeoff, and I think there might be some developing issues with the hydraulic systems." Sandra looked at this 14-year-old girl and heard nothing but childish anxiety. "Sweetie, that's just normal airplane sounds," she said, with a patronizing smile. "Flying can seem scary when you're not used to it, but I promise you have nothing to worry about. The pilots know what they're doing. Why don't you put on your headphones and try to relax?" Ella tried once more, this time being more specific. "I've studied aircraft systems extensively, and the vibration patterns suggest possible bearing issues in the number 2 engine. The hydraulic pressure fluctuations visible on the instrument reflection indicate." "Honey," Sandra interrupted, her voice becoming firmer. "I appreciate that you've been reading about airplanes, but leave the flying to the professionals. You're just making yourself anxious with all this technical talk. Try to get some sleep, okay?" Stella watched her sister's frustration and felt her own anger rising. They'd faced this dismissal their entire lives, but never when lives might be at stake. Still, the twins knew better than to cause a scene. They'd been raised to respect authority while standing firm in their convictions. They would wait, watch, and be ready when their expertise was finally needed. What Ella had spotted were the early warning signs of what would become a perfect storm of mechanical failures and weather emergencies. The storm system developing ahead of them was intensifying faster than meteorologists had predicted. Multiple aircraft were already reporting dangerous conditions, and air traffic control was beginning to route flights around increasingly unstable weather patterns. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was starting to notice irregularities that concerned him. 25 years of flying experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something felt wrong. Co-pilot Walsh was focused on standard flight procedures, but she was about to face challenges that her limited experience hadn't prepared her for. The Boeing 737 continued its eastward journey carrying passengers who trusted that everything was under control. But at 37,000 FT, with storm systems intensifying and mechanical issues developing, Flight 892 was heading toward a crisis that would test everyone aboard in ways they never imagined. Ella and Stella Williams closed their eyes and tried to rest, knowing they would need their strength for the emotional visit with their grandmother. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours, their years of training, their thousands of hours of study, and their unshakable determination would be the only thing standing between 220 innocent people and absolute disaster. If this story is already giving you chills, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will completely blow your mind. These 2 incredible young women are about to prove that heroes come in all ages, all colors, and all backgrounds. And I want to know, have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated your abilities because of your age or appearance? Drop your story in the comments below. Because Ella and Stella's journey is just getting started. 30 minutes into Flight 892's journey, the atmosphere in the cabin was deceptively calm. Passengers were settling into their routines. Business travelers typing on laptops, families sharing snacks, elderly passengers dozing peacefully. But in the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was beginning to notice subtle changes that made his experienced pilot instincts prickle with concern. The first sign was so minor that most pilots might have missed it entirely. A slight irregularity in the engine parameters, barely perceptible fluctuations in hydraulic pressure and electrical readings that didn't quite match the textbook normal ranges. Rodriguez had been flying for 25 years, and he'd learned to trust those gut feelings that separated good pilots from great ones. "Jennifer, are you seeing anything unusual on the engine readings?" he asked his co-pilot, keeping his voice casual but alert. Co-pilot Walsh glanced at her instruments, scanning the displays with the methodical approach she'd been trained to use. "Everything appears within normal parameters, Captain. Maybe slightly elevated on the number 2 engine temperature, but still well within acceptable ranges." Rodriguez nodded, but something nagged at him. Weather reports were also starting to change. The storm system ahead of them was developing faster and more intensely than meteorologists had predicted. Air traffic control was beginning to issue updated routing instructions to multiple aircraft in the area. Meanwhile, in seat 23A, Ella Williams was experiencing her own growing concern. Her trained eye continued to catch glimpses of instrument reflections, and what she was seeing painted a picture that made her increasingly worried. The hydraulic pressure fluctuations she'd noticed earlier were becoming more pronounced. The electrical system warnings were multiplying, and the engine vibration patterns were developing into signatures that her simulator training told her could indicate serious mechanical issues. "Stella," Ella whispered to her sleeping sister, "I think we might have a problem." Stella opened her eyes, immediately alert, despite having been in deep sleep moments before. Growing up in military families teaches you to wake up ready for anything. "What kind of problem?" Ella discreetly tilted her head toward the front of the aircraft. "Look at the reflection patterns on Sandra's tablet when she passes by. The cockpit displays are showing multiple warning indicators that suggest cascading system failures." Stella's eyes sharpened with focus. She'd spent just as many hours studying emergency scenarios as her sister, and she knew that cascading failures were among the most dangerous situations any aircraft could face. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just routine monitoring displays." "I've memorized every normal operational display for this aircraft type," Ella replied quietly. "What I'm seeing doesn't match normal parameters. We're dealing with hydraulic issues, electrical problems, and possible engine bearing failures, all developing simultaneously." The twins exchanged a look that communicated volumes. They'd been training for emergency scenarios since they were 10 years old. They knew more about aircraft systems than most commercial pilots learned in their entire careers. But they also knew that nobody on this aircraft would take their expertise seriously until it was potentially too late. Stella made a decision. "We need to try again to alert the crew." Ella shook her head. "Sandra already dismissed everything I told her. She thinks we're just anxious kids who don't understand what we're seeing." "Then we wait and watch," Stella said firmly. "But we stay ready." 45 minutes into the flight, the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone in the cockpit realized. Captain Rodriguez was now seeing clear indications that multiple systems were experiencing stress. The storm ahead of them was being upgraded from a routine weather system to a dangerous supercell formation. Air traffic control was routing aircraft around an increasingly large area of severe turbulence and dangerous wind shears. "Atlanta Center. This is United 892, Rodriguez radioed. "We're seeing some unusual readings on multiple systems, requesting permission to deviate around the weather and possibly divert to an alternate airport if conditions continue to deteriorate." United 892 standby for routing instructions. "We have multiple aircraft requesting weather deviations. The storm system is intensifying beyond forecast parameters." In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice increased turbulence. The smooth flight they'd been enjoying was becoming bumpier, and flight attendants were moving through the aisles with practiced efficiency, securing loose items and checking that seatbelts were fastened. Sandra Martinez approached rows 20 through 25 for her routine passenger check. When she reached Ella and Stella, she noticed that both girls were awake and alert, looking more focused than she'd expect from nervous teenagers. "How are you girls doing?" Sandra asked with professional courtesy. "The turbulence might get a bit stronger as we navigate around some weather, but it's nothing to worry about." Ella looked up at Sandra with serious eyes. "The turbulence isn't random," she said quietly. "The patterns suggest we're encountering wind shears consistent with severe storm cell development. Combined with the mechanical issues I mentioned earlier, this could become a very dangerous situation very quickly." Sandra's patience was wearing thin. She'd dealt with nervous passengers for 15 years, and she thought she knew how to handle anxious travelers. "Sweetheart, I understand that flying can be scary, but you really don't need to worry about technical details. The pilots are highly trained professionals who know exactly what they're doing." "Mom," Stella interjected politely but firmly, "my sister and I have extensive training in aircraft systems and emergency procedures. We're not nervous passengers. We're trying to help you understand that this aircraft is developing multiple critical issues that require immediate attention." Sandra looked at these two 14-year-old girls and saw nothing but teenage dramatics. "Girls, I appreciate your concern, but unless you have pilot licenses, I need you to let the crew handle the flight. Put on your headphones. Try to relax and trust that we know what we're doing." The twins watched Sandra walk away, frustration building, but discipline holding firm. They'd been raised to respect authority, while standing ready to serve when needed. Their mother had taught them that sometimes the hardest part of being exceptional is waiting for others to recognize your capabilities. 1 hour into Flight 892, the situation in the cockpit was becoming critical. Captain Rodriguez was now dealing with multiple confirmed system malfunctions. Hydraulic pressure in 2 separate systems was dropping below safe parameters. Electrical warnings were indicating problems with backup power systems. Most concerning, the number 2 engine was showing temperature and vibration readings that suggested imminent bearing failure. "Jennifer, I need you to start running emergency checklists," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with concentration. "We're looking at multiple system failures, and I want to be prepared for rapid escalation." Co-pilot Walsh felt her heart rate spike. She'd been flying commercially for only 18 months, and while she was competent and well-trained, she'd never faced a genuine multi-system emergency. "Which checklist should I prioritize, Captain?" "Start with hydraulic failure procedures, then electrical emergency protocols, and get me direct communication with Atlanta Approach Control. We're going to need priority handling and emergency equipment standing by." The weather situation was also deteriorating, beyond what anyone had anticipated. The storm system ahead of them was now classified as a severe supercell with embedded tornadoes, extreme turbulence, and wind shears that could tear an aircraft apart. Multiple flights were being diverted to alternate airports, and air traffic control was struggling to manage the increasing number of emergency declarations in the passenger cabin. People were beginning to sense that something beyond routine turbulence was happening. Experienced flyers noticed that the flight attendants' movements had become more purposeful and urgent. The captain's voice had changed tone during his last announcement, and the turbulence was unlike anything most passengers had experienced. Ella and Stella Williams were processing information that would overwhelm most adults. Through their observation of instrument reflections, crew behavior patterns, and the aircraft's flight characteristics, they were building a comprehensive picture of an emergency situation that was spiraling toward disaster. "Stella, we're looking at a perfect storm scenario," Ella whispered. "Multiple mechanical failures combined with severe weather conditions that exceed the aircraft's safe operating limits." "I know," Stella replied grimly. This is exactly the type of scenario Mum trained us for. Remember the simulator sessions where they threw everything at us simultaneously? System failures, weather emergencies, and crew incapacitation. Ella nodded. Those weren't just training exercises. Mum was preparing us for real-old situations where military families might face emergencies during civilian travel. The twins had undergone training that most commercial pilots never experience. Military emergency preparedness included scenarios where family members might need to assist in crisis situations. Colonel Patricia Williams had insisted that her daughters be prepared for any situation anywhere in the world. "Do you think we're the only people on this aircraft with the training to handle what's developing?" Stella asked quietly. Ella scanned the passenger cabin, evaluating everyone she could observe. "I don't see anyone else who's recognizing the signs. Most passengers are concerned about turbulence, but they don't understand that we're facing system failures that could make this aircraft uncontrollable." 75 minutes into Flight 892, Captain Rodriguez was fighting a losing battle against multiple cascading emergencies. The number 2 engine had just thrown several warning lights indicating immediate shutdown was required. Hydraulic pressure in the primary system had dropped to critical levels. Electrical backup systems were showing intermittent failures, and directly ahead of them was a wall of weather that looked like something from a disaster movie. Atlanta Center United 892 declaring emergency. "We have multiple system failures and are unable to maintain current flight path due to severe weather. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by. United 892, roger your emergency declaration. Vectors to Hartsfield, Jackson, Atlanta, runway 27 left. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Be advised, current conditions at destination include severe turbulence, wind shears, and reduced visibility." Rodriguez felt sweat beating on his forehead. In 25 years of flying, he'd never faced a situation this complex. Multiple system failures during severe weather conditions while carrying 220 passengers was every pilot's worst nightmare. "Jennifer, I need you to prepare for engine shutdown procedures. On number 2, then start calculating our approach options with degraded hydraulic systems." Sea Pilot Walsh was struggling to keep up with the rapidly developing emergency. Her training had covered these scenarios individually, but never in combination with such severe weather conditions. "Captain, I'm not sure I have the experience to handle this level of emergency complexity." Rodriguez understood her concern. Hell, he wasn't sure he had the experience to handle what they were facing, but they were the crew, and 220 lives depended on their ability to bring this aircraft safely to the ground. In the cabin, passengers were now clearly aware that something serious was happening. The engine shutdown procedure had created noticeable changes in sound and vibration. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles with obvious urgency, securing everything that could become dangerous during emergency procedures. Sandra Martinez was trying to maintain her professional composure, but 15 years of experience told her this was unlike any situation she'd previously faced. As she passed Ella and Stella's seats during her emergency preparation routine, she couldn't help but notice that both girls appeared remarkably calm compared to the adults around them. "Are you girls okay?" Sandra asked, genuinely concerned now rather than patronizing. Ella looked up with steady eyes. "We understand what's happening," she said simply. "Multiple system failures combined with severe weather emergency. The crew is going to need all the help they can get." Something in Ella's tone made Sandra pause. This wasn't the voice of a frightened teenager. This was the voice of someone who understood exactly what was happening and was prepared to deal with it. "What do you mean, help?" Sandra asked. "Mom," Stella said respectfully, "my sister and I have extensive emergency training. If the situation continues to deteriorate, we might be able to assist the crew with procedures and calculations that could save lives." Sandra looked at these two young girls, and for the first time really saw them not as children to be managed, but as individuals who might actually know what they were talking about. "What kind of training?" "Military family emergency preparedness," Ella replied. "Thousands of hours on advanced flight simulators, comprehensive aircraft systems knowledge, and specialized training in multi-system emergency procedures." Before Sandra could respond, the aircraft lurched violently as they encountered the edge of the storm system. Emergency lighting flickered, and several overhead bins popped open despite being properly secured. This wasn't normal turbulence. This was the kind of severe weather that could tear an aircraft apart. Mr. Peterson, the businessman who had complained about the girls being on the flight, was now gripping his armrests with white knuckles and looking around desperately for reassurance that everything would be okay. The irony was completely lost on him, that the two passengers he'd wanted, removed from the aircraft, might be the only ones capable of helping save his life. 90 minutes into Flight 892, the situation reached a critical tipping point. Captain Rodriguez was now dealing with a crisis that exceeded his worst-case scenario training. The storm system had intensified beyond all forecasts, creating conditions that made normal approach procedures impossible. The aircraft's degraded systems were making it increasingly difficult to maintain control, and his co-pilot was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were facing. Atlanta Approach United 892. We're encountering severe wind shears and downdrafts. Aircraft control is becoming increasingly difficult with degraded hydraulic systems. We need guidance for emergency approach procedures under these conditions. United 892 understood. Current winds at destination are gusting to 60 knots with significant directional changes. Runway 27 left is still available, but conditions are at the absolute limits of safe operations. Rodriguez felt the weight of 220 lives pressing down on him. He was an experienced pilot, but what they were facing required skills and knowledge that went beyond standard commercial aviation training. He needed help, but where could he find a pilot with the specialized experience necessary to handle this type of emergency? That's when he made the decision that would change everything. Swallowing his pride and acknowledging that this situation was beyond what he and his co-pilot could handle alone, Captain Rodriguez reached for the intercom and spoke the words that would transform two dismissed teenagers into heroes. But before he made that announcement, Ella and Stella Williams were already preparing themselves mentally for what they knew was coming. Their years of training, their thousands of hours of study, and their unshakable determination were about to be tested in the most real-world way possible. The twins looked at each other and nodded. They were ready. This is getting absolutely incredible, and we're just getting to the most intense part. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will leave you speechless. These two remarkable young women are about to face the ultimate test of everything they've learned. And I have to ask, when you were 14 years old, would you have been ready to step up and save hundreds of lives? Let me know in the comments what you think you would have done in Ella and Stella's situation. Flight 892 was now flying through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced military pilots. The storm system had become a monster, a supercell with embedded tornadoes, wind shears exceeding anything in the textbooks, and turbulence so severe that it was throwing passengers against their seatbelts with bone-jarring force. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was fighting for control of an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to fly. The number 2 engine was completely shut down now, its failure creating asymmetric thrust that made the aircraft want to yaw and roll in directions that could quickly become unreoverable. The primary hydraulic system pressure had dropped to levels that made normal flight controls sluggish and unresponsive. Electrical systems were failing intermittently, causing instrument displays to flicker and critical systems to operate on backup power that might not last much longer. "Jennifer, I need you to calculate our fuel remaining and determine if we have enough to reach an alternate airport with better weather conditions," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with concentration as he fought to keep the aircraft level. Co-pilot Walsh was struggling with calculations that would normally be routine. The stress of the emergency, combined with her limited experience in crisis situations, was making it difficult for her to process information quickly and accurately. "Captain, I'm showing approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates, but the engine shutdown and increased drag from flying through this weather are affecting my calculations." "That's not enough margin for error," Rodriguez realized grimly. "We're committed to Atlanta regardless of conditions." 100 minutes into the flight, the situation took a turn that would test everyone aboard beyond their limits. Captain Rodriguez, who had been fighting the controls and managing multiple emergencies for over an hour, suddenly felt a crushing pain in his chest that made his vision blur and his left arm go numb. "Jennifer," he gasped, "I think I'm having a heart attack." The words hit co-pilot Walsh like a physical blow. She watched in horror as Captain Rodriguez slumped forward in his seat, his hands slipping from the control yoke as a massive coronary event overwhelmed his system. Suddenly, she was alone in the cockpit of a damaged aircraft flying through the worst weather conditions she'd ever encountered, responsible for the lives of 220 passengers. Captain Rodriguez Walsh shook her colleague, but he was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The aircraft immediately began to drift off course as the autopilot system, already struggling with the degraded hydraulic systems, couldn't compensate for the severe turbulence and wind shears they were encountering. Walsh grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Atlanta Center, United 892. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain is incapacitated, and I'm now the only pilot available. Request immediate emergency assistance and guidance. United 892, copy your emergency. Medical emergency crews are standing by. What is your current status and capability?" Walsh tried to steady her voice, but the panic was evident. "I have 18 months of commercial flying experience, and I've never handled an emergency of this magnitude. Multiple system failures, severe weather conditions, and now I'm flying this aircraft alone." In the passenger cabin, people could sense that something catastrophic was happening. The aircraft's flight pattern had become erratic, climbing and descending unpredictably, as Walsh struggled to maintain control with degraded systems and no assistance. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles, trying to maintain calm while preparing for what might be an emergency landing under the worst possible conditions. Sandra Martinez was fighting her own rising panic as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. An incapacitated captain, an overwhelmed co-pilot, multiple mechanical failures and weather conditions that were beyond anything in her 15 years of flying experience. She looked around the cabin, desperately hoping to see someone who might be able to help. That's when her eyes fell on Ella and Stella Williams. Both girls were sitting calmly in their seats, not panicking like the adults around them. Instead, they appeared to be mentally processing information and preparing for action. Sandra remembered their earlier conversation about having extensive emergency training and suddenly wondered if she had dismissed expertise that could save everyone's life. Ella and Stella had been monitoring the situation through every available indicator: instrument reflections, crew behavior, aircraft performance characteristics, and their own understanding of emergency procedures. When Captain Rodriguez's medical emergency occurred, they immediately recognized that Flight 892 was now facing a crisis that exceeded normal emergency response capabilities. "Stella co-pilot Walsh doesn't have the experience to handle what we're facing," Ella said quietly. She's going to need help, and we might be the only people on this aircraft with the training to provide it." "I know," Stella replied. "This is exactly the scenario Mum prepared us for. A situation where civilian authority is overwhelmed and military training becomes necessary for survival. The twins had been raised in a military culture that emphasized service above self. When people needed help, you provided it regardless of whether others recognized your qualifications. Their mother had drilled into them that expertise carried responsibility, and that responsibility didn't disappear just because other people underestimated your capabilities." "Should we try to approach the cockpit?" Stella asked. Ella shook her head. "Not yet. Walsh is going to have to ask for help first. If we approach without being invited, we'll be seen as interfering kids rather than qualified assistants." In the cockpit, co-pilot Walsh was discovering that flying a damaged aircraft through severe weather conditions was beyond anything her training had prepared her for. The hydraulic problems were making the controls increasingly unresponsive. The electrical failures were causing instrument readings to fluctuate unpredictably, and the weather conditions were throwing the aircraft around with forces that threatened to exceed structural limits. "Atlanta Center, United 892, Walsh radioed, her voice cracking with stress. "I don't think I can handle this alone. The aircraft is becoming increasingly difficult to control, and I don't have the experience to manage these multiple emergencies simultaneously. United 892 copy. We're going to walk you through emergency procedures step by step. First, let's work on stabilizing your flight path and getting you lined up for an emergency approach." But Walsh knew that radio guidance wouldn't be enough. She needed someone in the cockpit with her. Someone who understood aircraft systems and emergency procedures at a level that could complement her basic flying skills. She needed another pilot. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. Co-pilot Walsh reached for the passenger intercom system and spoke the words that everyone aboard had been dreading. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is co-pilot Walsh speaking. We have experienced a medical emergency in the cockpit, and I need to know immediately. Is there any military pilot, any fighter pilot whatsoever on board this aircraft?" The cabin erupted in murmurs and gasps as passengers looked around desperately, hoping someone would step forward. Business travelers scanned the aisles. Mothers clutched their children, and elderly passengers closed their eyes in prayer. Everyone was looking for a hero, for someone with the skills to save their lives. Seconds passed that felt like hours. No one stood up. No one raised their hand. No one stepped forward to claim the expertise that could bring Flight 892 safely to the ground. A businessman in first class half raised his hand, then lowered it sheepishly. "I've taken some flying lessons," he mumbled to his seatmate, "but I've never flown anything bigger than a Cessna." A retired mechanic in row 15 considered speaking up. He'd worked on aircraft for 30 years, but he'd never actually piloted one. His mechanical knowledge, while extensive, wouldn't help fly a damaged Boeing 737 through severe weather. The silence stretched on, heavy with desperation and growing fear. Passengers were beginning to realize that no qualified pilot was going to save them. They were trapped at 37,000 FT in a damaged aircraft with only an overwhelmed co-pilot between them and disaster. That's when Ella Williams stood up. "Mum," she called out clearly, her young voice cutting through the cabin noise. "My sister and I can assist you." The entire cabin turned to stare at this 14-year-old girl who had just claimed she could help fly a commercial airliner. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the passengers. Some people actually laughed, thinking they were witnessing teenage delusion under stress. Mr. Peterson, the businessman who had complained about the girls being on the flight, stood up angrily. "This is insane," he shouted. We're not going to let children play with our lives. Someone needs to stop this nonsense before these kids get us all killed." Other passengers began voicing similar concerns. A mother holding her baby looked horrified at the thought of teenagers in the cockpit. An elderly man shook his head and muttered about kids these days thinking they know everything. But Sandra Martinez, who had spent the entire flight observing Ella and Stella, was beginning to see something that others missed. These weren't typical teenagers claiming abilities they didn't possess. Their demeanor, their knowledge, their calm confidence under pressure. It suggested training and expertise that went far beyond their apparent age. "Girls," Sandra said, approaching their seats quickly, "are you absolutely certain you have the training to help in this situation?" Stella stood up beside her sister, and both girls looked Sandra directly in the eyes with a steadiness that was remarkable for their age. "Mom, we have thousands of hours of training on advanced flight simulators, comprehensive knowledge of aircraft systems, and emergency procedures and specific preparation for multi-system failure scenarios, exactly like what this aircraft is experiencing." "But you're 14 years old," Sandra protested, even as she found herself believing them. "Age doesn't determine expertise," Ella replied calmly. "Training, knowledge, and experience do, and we have all three." The twins began walking toward the front of the aircraft, moving with purpose and confidence that made other passengers step aside despite their objections. As they passed each row, Ella began speaking in a clear voice that carried throughout the cabin. "My name is Ella Williams, and this is my sister, Stella. We are the daughters of Colonel Patricia Williams, United States Air Force. We have been trained since childhood on military-grade flight simulators and emergency procedures. We have more flight training experience than most commercial pilots receive in their initial certification programs," Stella continued seamlessly. "We know this aircraft type inside and out. We've studied every system, memorized every emergency procedure, and trained extensively on scenarios involving multiple failures combined with severe weather conditions. We're not children playing games. We're trained personnel responding to an emergency." Mr. Peterson tried to block their path. "I don't care what you claim," he said loudly. "I'm not letting teenagers into that cockpit to experiment with our lives." Ella looked at him with eyes that held more wisdom and determination than many adults possessed. "Sir, right now your choice isn't between teenagers and adults helping you. Your choice is between trained personnel who can assist the co-pilot or no help at all. There is no other qualified pilot on this aircraft. How do we know you're really trained?" demanded a passenger from the middle of the cabin. Without hesitation, Stella began reciting technical specifications that silenced the skeptics. "This aircraft is a Boeing 737-800 with CFM56 7B engines. Current emergency indications suggest hydraulic system failure, electrical system degradation, affecting backup power distribution, and severe weather conditions, including wind shears exceeding 40 knots with directional changes greater than 90 degrees. Ella continued the technical assessment. Emergency approach procedures under these conditions require manual flight control compensation for asymmetric thrust, hydraulic-assisted steering limitations, and calculated approach speeds adjusted for increased aircraft weight, due to fuel that couldn't be dumped safely in current weather conditions." The cabin fell silent. These weren't the words of children pretending to know about airplanes. This was the language of trained aviation professionals discussing specific, technical challenges that required expert knowledge to understand. Sandra made her decision. "I'm taking them to the cockpit," she announced to the cabin. "At this point, any qualified help is better than no help at all." As the twins moved toward the front of the aircraft, they could hear co-pilot Walsh's increasingly desperate radio communications with air traffic control. Her voice was cracking under the stress of trying to manage an emergency that was beyond her experience level. Atlanta Center, United 892. I'm having difficulty maintaining aircraft control. The weather conditions, combined with system failures, are exceeding my ability to compensate. I need immediate guidance on emergency approach procedures for these conditions. United 892. We're going to walk you through the procedures step by step. First, reduce power on your remaining engine to minimum approach setting and prepare for manual trim adjustments to compensate for asymmetric thrust. But Walsh's voice came back, shaking with uncertainty. Atlanta Center, I'm not sure I can execute these procedures safely. I've never performed manual approach calculations under these conditions with degraded aircraft systems. That's when Sandra knocked on the cockpit door. Ma'am, I have 2 passengers who claim to have extensive flight training and emergency procedure knowledge. They're requesting permission to assist you. Through the intercom, co-pilot Walsh's voice was heavy with desperation. Send them up. At this point, I'll take any help I can get. Sandra opened the cockpit door, and Ella and Stella Williams stepped into the flight deck of a commercial airliner that was fighting for its life. What they saw there would have overwhelmed most adults. Instrument panels flashing with warning lights, weather radar showing a massive storm system directly ahead, and an unconscious captain slumped in his seat while a young co-pilot struggled with controls that were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Co-pilot Walsh looked up at these 2 teenagers and felt her heart sink. Please tell me you're older than you look, she said desperately. Ma'am, we're 14 years old, Ella replied honestly. But we have the training and knowledge necessary to help you bring this aircraft safely to the ground. Walsh stared at them for a moment, processing the impossibility of her situation. Then she looked at her instrument panel at the weather radar, showing conditions that could kill everyone aboard, and at the unconscious captain who couldn't help her anymore. Prove it, she said simply. Ella immediately moved to the captain's position and began scanning the instrument displays with the systematic efficiency of a trained pilot. You're showing hydraulic system a failure with pressure dropping below minimum operational parameters. Electrical backup systems are operating on emergency power with approximately 20 minutes of reserves remaining. Weather radar indicates severe turbulence with embedded wind shears that require specific approach vector calculations to avoid structural damage. Stella positioned herself at the engineering panel and began calling out critical information. Fuel remaining is 32 minutes at current consumption rates. Number 2, engine shutdown has created asymmetric thrust, requiring constant rudder pressure to maintain directional control. Landing gear status is uncertain due to electrical system degradation. Co-pilot Walsh felt a surge of hope for the first time since Captain Rodriguez had collapsed. These weren't children playing with airplane controls. These were trained individuals who understood exactly what they were facing and knew how to address it. What do you recommend? Walsh asked, ready to accept help from any source that could save the lives of everyone aboard. Ella and Stella exchanged a look, mentally accessing years of training and thousands of hours of preparation for exactly this scenario. They were ready to prove that heroes come in all ages, all backgrounds,